Before I start the vid, I just want to quickly thank the Great Courses Plus for supporting my channel. The Great Courses Plus is an on-demand video service with lectures and courses from world-leading universities and scientific institutions. They've got over 11,000 video lectures on all sorts of topics: art, science, literature, and of course history and archaeology. I just finished Understanding Imperial China, Dynasties, Life and Culture by Professor Andrew Wilson. You wouldn't catch me taking that civil service entrance exam. Bloody hell. You can watch all of these for free. Simply click on the link in the description or visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/Stefan to start your free trial. Hey everyone, how's it going? At various points in human history, even up until today, if you watch grand designs like I do, people have lived in longhouses, timber longhouses, like this Chinookan plank house behind me here at Cathlapotle, Washington, which I have made a video on. It's one of the first videos I made on this channel, so if you're going to go watch it, go easy on me. I was trying my best. Over in Europe, I think it's fair to say they're most commonly associated with the Vikings. But way before the Vikings, way before the Danes realized how easy it was to rob English monasteries, timber longhouses had spread across the whole of Central Europe, from Normandy in the west to Ukraine in the east. I think I was pointing in the wrong directions there, never mind. This society is called the LBK, or the Linear Band Ceramic, by archaeologists, and they expanded across the continent extremely quickly and then declined in really dramatic, bloody fashion. So today I'm going to take a look at the archaeology and see if we can kind of understand the causes behind the rise and fall of Europe's first longhouse culture. Okay, so let's quickly talk about who and what the LBK culture was for those who might not know. Neolithic farming groups arrived in Europe around 7000 BCE from Anatolia and had slowly been making their way north through the Balkans, reaching what is now Hungary by around 6000 BCE. Here, the Neolithic seems to have paused for about 400 to 500 years. Archaeologists aren't sure exactly why, but it was probably because these Neolithic farming groups had to adapt to a new environment. Not only did crops potentially have to adjust to a different climate and different daylight hours the further north these farming groups traveled, but perhaps culturally things needed to change too. The culture of tell-building villages that served farmers so well in Anatolia, the Aegean, and the Balkans was maybe not as well suited to the flatter, heavily forested environment of Central Europe at that time. Around 5600 to 5500 BCE, the LBK culture seems to have arisen in what is now Hungary, Austria, northern Serbia, the general Carpathian region. Perhaps more specifically around Lake Balaton, where it evolved out of the Neolithic Starchevo culture which spanned the Balkans. At St. Georgi Volgi Pityadom, forgive me, Hungary, a Starchevo village was replaced by an LBK culture site around 5500 BCE. Whatever the reason for this delay, the farming groups in this region had finally hit upon a winning lifestyle. They focused much more on a select few crops, particularly emmer and einkorn wheat, and instead of focusing on sheep and goats, cattle and pig domestication becomes much more common. Named after the incised lines that adorn their pottery, the LBK is probably more readily recognized by their distinctive longhouses. The typical early LBK longhouse was commonly orientated north to south, consisted of 3 rows of posts dividing the internal space, and was surrounded by pits which archaeologists believe served 2 purposes. It provided a source of mud for wattle and door walls, before probably then being a convenient place to throw all your rubbish. Although there are small variations in design, these houses are remarkably uniform across Central Europe. From its origins around 5500 BCE, In just 200 years, the LBK had spread as far west as the Rhine and had reached northern Poland. 300 years after that, it had reached Normandy in the west and almost the Black Sea in the east. By 5100 BCE, it is estimated that there were 15,000 LBK households across Central Europe and a population as high as maybe 100,000 people. Huge difference compared to the preceding Mesolithic. Alright, there you go. The LBK was Central Europe's first farming culture. So how did they spread from the Carpathians to Ukraine and Normandy in just a few centuries? Well, if there's one thing we can say for sure, it wasn't because local hunter-gatherers adopted farming. We can tell from the genetics of people buried in LBK cemeteries that this spread was purely demographic. LBK groups were the descendants of the Anatolian farmers that had crossed into Europe 1500 years ago, with just some minor exceptions, just a little bit of sex with the preceding Mesolithic people. It was suggested that one reason for the rapid spread of LBK sites was the use of slash-and-burn agriculture. The land that these farmers would work would gradually become less and less fertile, and these communities would move on to clear another piece of forest. We do have a little bit of evidence for large-scale forest clearing at a few LBK sites, but it is far from overwhelming. The LBK farmers were extremely picky when it came to which land they occupied. Their houses appear exclusively along rivers, and even then they're clearly selecting very fertile spots that really appeal to them. Experiments have shown that to feed a community of 20 people for a year would have required around 10 hectares of land, which sounds like a lot, but that's only 3% of the land within a kilometer radius of the settlement. So the land that they chose could have supported quite a large community. Finally, riverbanks, particularly the choicest, juiciest spots, are great at maintaining consistent crop yields for long periods of time. Consequently, falling crop yields were not likely to be a major concern for them and are unlikely to be the reason for their expansion. Well, is there another possible reason then? What if they moved on to escape the tyrannical clutches of their older brother? Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, how can we possibly tell that in the archaeological record? Well, let me make the case for you. It is possible that LBK communities were patrilocal. This means that the men often stayed in one location, inheriting the family farm, whilst women move around as they married. By studying the relationship of strontium isotopes in our bones and teeth, archaeologists can tell if we have died in the same region that we spent our childhood in. A 2012 study of over 300 early LBK graves shows a marked difference between men and women. Women were much more likely to have moved than men were. And even within men, there was also a difference between men buried with adzes and those without. Men buried with adzes were less likely to have moved than men who were buried without them. This is interpreted by the authors of that study as evidence of patrilocality. Maybe this adze is some symbol of a higher status, and they had access to the better soils and so had less reason to move. A possible social difference between newcomers and founding families can also be observed in the layout and structure of some LBK villages. At Curie-les-Chaudards, France, in northern France, the LBK village is made up of two types of houses. Large houses that have great evidence for stock keeping, cereal grinding, and very consistent pottery traditions. And small houses, which more often hunted and had a wider variety of pottery making techniques. The first is interpreted as the houses of long-established farmers with access to the best, most fertile lands, capable of producing an agricultural surplus. The second are interpreted as the houses of newcomers, in the process of establishing themselves in the new area without access to the choicest spots, more reliant on hunting, things like that. Finally, LBK houses seem to have been short-lived structures lasting just one generation. There's also not great evidence for them being built over, suggesting that abandoned houses lived on in the landscape. Were they some symbolic link to the ancestors? Perhaps the act of constructing these houses was an essential feature or ritual of their culture. Okay, so how does all this relate to the spread of their culture? Well, let's say hypothetically you're a young LBK farmer starting out in life. You can't stay at home. Houses last one generation. You've got to leave. You've got to build your new house. Do you stay in your village and live with inferior access to the best land that perhaps has been claimed by your older brother or some other high-status male? Or do you move upriver, knowing full well that there is great land to be had elsewhere, confident in the knowledge that if you are the founder of a village, you get the best land and your descendants will be of a high status? There's much more evidence for this idea than I've presented here, of course. Check out First Farmers of Europe for more. I do bloody love that book. If our interpretations of the evidence are correct, and they may not be, of course, but if they are, there would be a huge pressure for lower status members of LBK society to continually move on. Obviously, such a system can only exist if there is new land to move to. What happens when the riverbanks are full of houses? There's no more new land. How did the LBK react to such a scenario? This brings us neatly to part 3, the fall of the LBK. Towards the end of the LBK, which is around 5000 BCE to 4800 BCE-ish, it varies depending on region, we see a marked change in the archaeological record. Sites are abandoned, the population seems to have crashed, long-distance trade is interrupted, villages become enclosed, probably fortified, and evidence of large-scale conflict, violence, warfare, whatever you want to call it, appears in the archaeological record. The evidence for warfare is particularly interesting because it's really the first time in European history that we see it so abundantly and clearly. Not only do many LBK villages become fortified, but we also find mass graves from massacres. 3 big ones in particular have been discovered so far. The Talheim death pit is probably the most famous, so today I'll cover the other 2. At Schöneck-Kilienstaaten, a mass grave of at least 26 individuals was discovered, dated to sometime between 5200 and 4850 BCE. These people were tossed carelessly into a pre-existing ditch in a village of around 18 LBK houses. There is absolutely no doubt these people were murdered. Blunt force trauma to the head seems to have been their method of execution, though some may have been shot with arrows as well. What is unique about Kilienstaaten compared to other LBK massacre sites is the evidence for peri-mortem destruction of the limbs. Basically, their legs were probably broken when they were alive. In some circumstances, this violence may have taken on a ritual aspect. At Herxheim, Germany, an enclosure has been excavated that contained the remains of a whopping 500 people. What is even more astounding is that only half the site has been excavated, so perhaps as many as 1,000 people lay buried there. Even more astounding is that it seems that these people were eaten. The bodies were definitely skinned and defleshed, which isn't evidence in itself of cannibalism because some burial rituals involve defleshing, but these bones were deposited alongside animal remains and broken pots and just the general kind of things you would expect to see after a feast or a meal, stuff like that, suggesting that these people were eaten along with those animals. Pretty crazy stuff, really. I mean, clear-cut evidence of mass cannibalism does not often appear in the archaeological record. It's not often you find 1,000 bodies that have been eaten. Crazy. Again, could this disaster that befell LBK communities be explained by demographic pressures? As I said earlier, at the start of the LBK, when Europe was only sparsely populated by hunter-gatherers, these farming groups could just split up at will. They always had the ability to move further upriver, move away from each other, take some tension out of their communities. Towards the end, though, as the rivers of Europe become full of villages, one group's demographic success couldn't help but affect neighboring groups. The fortunes of your family would have been increasingly dependent on working together with your neighbors, fortifying your village, attacking other villages that may threaten yours, lest you become lunch first. Okay, there you have it. The rise and fall of Europe's first Longhouse culture was perhaps entirely due to demographic pressures, demographic forces at the start, out of a desire to escape your older brother and get that sweet, sweet, fertile soil, and at the end, out of a desire to not become lunch when your neighbors become too powerful. Obviously, our impressions and ideas can change the more we uncover and the more we excavate, and certainly many big questions remain. One of the biggest is probably if at the end of the LBK the demographic pressure had gotten so extreme that people had resorted to eating each other and violence on a large scale, then why did they stick so doggedly to their riverside villages? Why didn't they experiment more with farming inland? Why did it take so long for farming inland to develop under such circumstances? We don't have an answer to that question. It's something for future archaeology to uncover, I suppose. Skiddly-doo. Thanks to my top-tier Patreons, they're the real skiddly-doers, the real big skiddly-doos. I'm going to go home now. See ya.